Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. Our book is The World of Philosophy, an introductory reader by Stephen Kahn. And in this video, we're going over John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume, the British empiricists. And this is for Exam 2, Part A, Question 2. What are the similarities and differences between the empiricist views of knowledge put forth by Locke, Berkeley, and Hume? Which position is better argued? Why? Explain. Okay, so as I say in every video, this is an introductory class, so these are some pretty complicated readings, and this is a 250-word essay you're supposed to write, so don't think you have to master any of these philosophers, but just be familiar enough with the basic ideas and be able to support that with a couple of pertinent quotes to develop your opinion, and you'll be fine. As long as I can tell you've read the reading and have spent some time thinking about it, you should get full credit. So the empiricists. So this is part A, question 2. We'll also be going over part B, question 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and a little bit of 8. So what is empiricism? What is rationalism? What is idealism? What is skepticism? Explain Locke's tabula rasa idea. Explain Leibniz's criticisms of Locke. We did that in the previous video. I'll touch on it very briefly. Explain Berkeley's argument against matter, and what is the difference between a priori and a posteriori knowledge. So those are the questions we'll be going over. Locke, we went over in the previous video for question 1 of part A, which was to compare Descartes and Leibniz, the rationalists. But I went over Locke also because Leibniz was only one page, and half of that was his criticism of John Locke, so we couldn't really understand what Leibniz was talking about if we didn't understand John Locke. And also, just to explain the basic difference between empiricism and rationalism, I included John Locke. So empiricists, like John Locke and Berkeley and Hume, they think the ultimate source of knowledge is our sense perceptions. So John Locke thinks we have sense perceptions of material objects that exist outside of our mind. Then Berkeley comes and says, we don't have any reason to believe that there's a material object outside of our mind that causes us to have sense perceptions. Sense perceptions are just ideas in the mind. I see a roughly spherical object that's red, that has a certain weight. When I put all those sensory perceptions together, I call that an apple. That's Berkeley's example. That's an idea in my mind. That apple is an idea in my mind. It's an unwarranted assumption to place that idea as representing some object outside of a mind in an unthinking substance, which he does not agree with. So he doesn't agree that empirical knowledge comes from material objects outside of the mind. He just agrees that knowledge comes from sense perceptions. But our sense perceptions are just ideas in the mind. That's Berkeley. And then Berkeley also says the reason that some ideas in our mind are more vivid and enduring than others, namely the objects we see, here's a phone. So how come that idea in my mind, somebody else who was to come down those stairs would say, oh yeah, I see that also. And yet if I'm thinking of a number, what is it? 1 through a billion, it's 6,000. How come you couldn't see that? And then Berkeley will say, because this material object I'm holding up is an idea in God's mind. God is the universal mind, and all things exist as ideas in God's mind. But still, there's no such thing as a unthinking substance existing outside of a mind. And even if there was, there'd be no way to prove it. So that's an overview of Berkeley. Then David Hume comes along and he says he agrees with Berkeley against John Locke's assumption that there are these objects outside of our mind causing the sense impressions we have of them. Locke says there are secondary qualities and primary qualities of matter. Secondary qualities are the smells and the sounds and the tastes and the feeling of of something, if it's hot or cold or rough or smooth, those are subjective opinions, but there are also primary qualities of matter, such as extension and mobility, that belong to the object itself. And those primary qualities of matter, the way they interact with the minute particles of our sense organs and the nerve endings which lead to the brain, that's what creates ideas in our mind. So says John Locke. The ideas in our mind that we call sense perceptions are caused by imperceptible little atoms radiating from material objects existing outside of our mind and interacting with the imperceptible little atoms of our nerve endings on our sense organs, which stimulates the brain in such a way as to create an idea. Ideas are caused by material objects existing outside of the mind, says Locke. Berkeley says that doesn't make any sense. The idea of a material object existing outside of the mind, for him, he says that it's an unnecessary assumption. We don't need that. All we have ever experienced are ideas in our mind. So why must we assume that those ideas are caused by unthinking objects outside of our mind? And then David Hume will say, I agree with Berkeley. He doesn't say I agree with Berkeley, but he agrees that we can't know that there are material objects existing outside of our mind, like Locke assumes that there are. But also, Hume will say we can't be certain that there's a God creating ideas in our mind of these so-called material objects. We can't be certain of any causative principle, says David Hume. That's what he's so famous for. Because, taking empiricism to its limit, we don't have any sense perception of causality, the connecting principle of causality. There is no chain of cause and effect. We never perceive it. We don't see it, smell it, touch it, taste it, or hear it. It's a custom of the mind to link events that we've seen in the past in succession. Event A is always followed by event B. There's a flame, you put your finger in it, it always hurts, no matter who you are. Flame causes pain in finger. Hume would say, well, yes, we've seen in the past people putting their finger in a flame and it hurts, but nowhere in that series of events do you see a thing called cause. That the flame causes pain in the finger is just an assumption of the mind. Assuming that the way things have worked in the past must necessarily work in the future. It's how we live. We need to make those assumptions to survive in the world, but, says Hume, we can't be absolutely certain that the way things happen in the past will always occur that way in the future. So we have no certain knowledge of the way things work. There are no settled laws of nature. For Berkeley, the laws of nature are the way God's mind and his so-called material objects are the ideas in God's mind. They follow regular patterns. We can perceive those and learn those regular patterns of the flow of events, of these vivid ideas in God's mind, these real things. That's how you learn the laws of nature, through empirical observations. When you have sensory perceptions that teaches you the pattern of things, and you can trust that those are laws of nature because it's the workings of the mind of God. So Hume says, how do you know there's a God? Maybe you just took your own idea of the virtues of a human and amplified them in your mind to a limitless proportion, and then that's how you came up with the idea of God. There's no innate idea of God imprinted on the soul. So that's why Hume is considered to be the empiricist who takes empiricism to its limit. So that's an overview of the agreements and disagreements between Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. So now I'm going to go over just some excerpts from each of these. I'm going to try to keep it moving, but this is what we would be doing if we were in a classroom. We'll just go over the text. So the whole point of this class is to introduce you to these philosophers, and they're, it's not only interesting to read the philosophical ideas they have, but also the writing style that they have is interesting, and it helps you to understand not only their philosophical ideas, but also the evolution of these ideas in the history of philosophy. It's interesting to see how one philosopher develops into the next philosopher, picks up where that one left off, shows a contradiction, takes it to the next level, and so on. So that's also what we'll be doing here. All right, so we went over John Locke in some detail when we went over Descartes and Leibniz. So I'll try to keep this at a quicker pace. So on page 66, the first thing that I'm going to point out is he rejects the idea of innate principles. We saw on page 69 and on page 70 that he does believe in two innate principles. Knowledge of our own being we have by intuition. The existence of a God, reason clearly makes known to us. So he says that much we can know through just our own minds. We don't need sense perceptions to teach us that. But then he goes on to say, this is page 69, the knowledge of the existence of any other thing we can have only by sensation. So that is his empiricism. Berkeley's going to agree. We can know our own mind. We can know God's mind. Everything else we learn through sense perceptions. So that's one agreement between Locke and Berkeley. Hume is going to say we can't know that there's a God, and in a later part of the book he's going to say we can't even know that there's a self, that there's a mind that endures from one moment to the next, because you don't have a sense perception of it. All right, so Locke does believe you can know that you exist. There is a self and there's a God. Everything else you learn through sense perceptions. There are no other innate ideas. If there were, he says on page 66 on the right hand column, then they should be universally known to all people. But even these laws of logic, such as what is, and it is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be, those seem to be self-evident truths of logic. What is. Okay, that makes sense. It's impossible for something to be and not to be, the law of contradiction. You can't be one thing and another thing at the same time in the same manner. And you can know that for certain, and then you can apply that basic logical rule to the universe around you and figure out some certain elemental truths. But Locke says those aren't universal truths known to everybody, because children don't know them, and idiots is his word, by which he just means people without the capacity for rational thought. If they were self-evident truths imprinted on the soul, then even the most dim-witted or uneducated person should nevertheless have this knowledge right in their face. If it's kind of like tattooed on your eyeball, if it's imprinted on your soul, how come they don't know it? We saw Leibniz say, what, you don't think we have an unconscious mind? Where do you think memories are stored? There are things in the mind of which we're not constantly aware, so there can be these innate, inborn forms of knowledge, and yet we're not always aware of them. How else do you explain things like memories and instinctive knowledge? I'll come back to that. So I'll read here on page 66 on the right-hand column, for to imprint anything on the mind without the mind's perceiving it seems to me hardly intelligible. If therefore children and idiots have souls, have minds with those impressions upon them, they must unavoidably perceive them. So that's his rejection of the idea that we're born with certain principles of knowledge imprinted on the soul. So then on page 67, the left-hand column, to discover the nature of our ideas the better, and to discourse of them intelligibly, it will be convenient to distinguish them as they are ideas or perceptions in our minds, and as they are modifications of matter in the bodies that cause such perceptions in us, so that we may not think, as perhaps usually is done, that they are exactly the images and resemblances of something inherent in the subject. All right, so this is his idea of primary and secondary qualities. The mind perceives these secondary qualities, which are our sense perceptions. Sweetness, the color of a thing that can change. If you get jaundice, something that formerly tasted sweet will taste sour, and you could be colorblind. So what causes our sense perceptions of things is an interaction between the imperceptible particles he talks about on pages 68 and 69. of the material object outside of our mind, the primary qualities of that material object, which are just extension in space and mobility, solidity. It says at the bottom of page 67, the left-hand column, take a grain of wheat. Here he's talking about these primary qualities. Divided into two parts. Each part has still solidity, extension, figure, and mobility. So those are the primary qualities. You can divide any material object as far as you want. Each divisible part will have solidity, extension, figure, and mobility. And those primary qualities interact with our sense organs and what he'll call the nerve endings. So the motion of these primary qualities of matter interacting with our physical bodies create an image in the brain. How does a material, soulless particle create a conscious image? That he doesn't explain, and that is, we'll be discussing in the next part of the book, the mind-body problem. How can any, no matter how complex, how can a series of inert events create a conscious event? It seems like they are completely different types of being. For one to come from the other, it's hard to explain, but Locke assumes that it's these motions, the interactions of our sense organs and the material objects outside of our mind create the ideas, and the ideas we have, these sense impressions, resemble things that are outside of our mind. They don't, those things outside of our mind don't have secondary qualities such as color and taste and odors. Those are the effects that they have on our sense organs and our brain, but these things outside of our mind do have the primary qualities. And I'll just read a little bit here. He says on the bottom of page 67, if then external objects be not united to our minds when they produce ideas therein, and yet we perceive these original qualities in such of them as singly fall under our senses, it is evident that some motion must be thence continued by our nerves or animal spirits, by some parts of our bodies to the brain or the seat of sensation, there to produce in our minds the particular ideas we have of them. And since the extension, figure, number, and motion of bodies of an observable bigness may be perceived at a distance by the sight, it is evident some singly imperceptible bodies must come from them to the eyes, and thereby convey to the brain some motion which produces these ideas which we have of them in us. These operation of these insensible, minute particles with our nerve endings in our brain. That's what he says causes us to have these ideas. That's the main point, and I'm going to leave it at that because we also went over John Locke when we covered Descartes and Leibniz. Okay, so with that, we move to George Berkeley. So again, Berkeley does not believe in the material objects existing outside of the mind, and he takes specific issue with John Locke's division of the qualities of matter into the secondary qualities and the primary qualities. Berkeley agrees the secondary qualities are only in the mind, but he'll say, so are the primary qualities. There is no material object existing outside of a perceiving mind. The essence of these objects is to be perceived. And let me just say here, and I'll be bringing this up in more detail when we go over the next part of the book, which is the mind-body problem, what is a self? But this idea of a material object existing outside of the mind, if it's perceived or not, definitely brings up the issue of quantum mechanics, which we will be discussing. Some of the authors we'll be reading talk about quantum mechanics. So the ideas that George Berkeley was working with and John Locke was the idea of little material atoms existing outside of the mind. Without a soul, they're there, whether you observe them or not. They float in 3 dimensions of space along a linear dimension of time. They have no soul. They're just inert, material, solid things extended in space. That's what matter's made of. So quantum mechanics which was formalized in 1927 and improved upon ever since, says that these little material particles only exist as little particles when they're being observed. If you're not directly observing them or measuring them in some way, then they behave like what is called mathematical waves of probability. For where a little particle might appear, were you to observe that wave of probability, it would most likely appear at the peak, but it could exist anywhere in the wave, and the wave extends out to infinity. So it could conceivably appear anywhere, but most likely at the peak. So quantum mechanics seems to support George Berkeley, at least in the sense that physical, tangible objects, or at least the atoms of which they're made, don't exist as physical things outside of an observing mind. You could make that argument. It definitely adds support to Berkeley's claim that there's no such thing as a material object existing outside of an observing mind. Observer-created reality, it's called for quantum mechanics. It has to do with the two-slit experiment. If you want to look on Google, Dr. Quantum two-slit experiment is a good YouTube video. I would put it up, but I think they would just take it down. But it's a little cartoon that shows the experiment that they conducted to figure out this wave particle nature of matter. All right, so Berkeley, I'm just going to read a few excerpts here, and then we'll get to David Hume. But he's going to attack the idea of matter existing outside of an observing mind, and he's going to build that attack on his claim that you can't separate primary and secondary qualities of matter. You can't think of a primary quality of matter, extension, solidity, mobility, without automatically attaching secondary qualities of matter to it. I'll read that on page 75, the left-hand column near the bottom. He says, now, if it be certain that those original qualities are inseparably united with the other sensible qualities, so if those primary qualities are inseparable from the secondary qualities, and not, even in thought, capable of being abstracted from them, it plainly follows that they exist only in the mind. But I desire anyone to reflect and try whether he can, by any abstraction of thought, conceive the extension and motion of a body without all other sensible qualities. For my own part, I see evidently that it is not in my power to frame an idea of a body extended and moved, but I must withal give it some color or other sensible quality which is acknowledged to exist only in the mind. In short, extension, figure, and motion, abstracted from all other qualities, are inconceivable. Where, therefore, the other sensible qualities are, there must these be also to wit in the mind and nowhere else. So again, his big radical claim is all that exists are ideas and the minds that perceive them. There is no matter that exists outside of the mind. And I'm going to go back over here. So this is exam 2, part B, question 7. Explain Berkeley's argument against matter. And also part B, question 3, what is idealism? So this is idealism. The so-called material objects are just ideas in the mind. The vivid material, the reason that the apparently material objects are so vivid is because they're ideas in the universal, all-powerful mind of God. God's ideas are what we call tangible reality. But if you analyze them carefully, you'll figure out they're just ideas in our mind and in the mind of God, and you can't even conceive of them existing outside of a mind. So let me return back to this video. It cuts off sometimes when I click back and forth. Glad it didn't. All right, so on page 73, here he is as an empiricist. He says, I'll just start at the beginning. It is evident to anyone who takes a survey of the objects of human knowledge that they are either ideas actually imprinted on the senses, or else such as are perceived by attending to the passions and operations of the mind, or lastly, ideas formed by help of memory and imagination. He goes on to say, by sight I have the ideas of light and colors with their several degrees and variations. By touch I perceive the example, for example, hard and soft, heat and cold. Smelling furnishes me with odors, the palate with tastes. And as several of these are observed to accompany each other, they come to be marked by one name and so to be reputed as one thing. For example, an apple. So that's what we call material objects. They are really a combination of different sense perceptions that come together regularly, and we combine those separate sense impressions into a single thing, like an apple. Then on 74, continuing, he says, but besides all that endless variety of ideas or objects of knowledge, there is likewise something which knows or perceives them and exercises diverse operations as willing, imagining, remembering about them. This perceiving active being is what I call mind, spirit, soul, or myself, by which words I do not denote any one of my ideas, but a thing entirely distinct from them, wherein they exist, or, which is the same thing, whereby they are perceived, for the existence of an idea consists in being perceived. So, all the things we call material are actually ideas in a mind. A little lower on the left-hand column on page 74, for as to what is said of the absolute existence of unthinking things without any relation to their being perceived, that seems perfectly unintelligible. Their essay is percipi, or is that percipi? I'm not sure, but their essence is perception, nor is it possible that they should have any existence out of the minds or thinking things which perceive them. So you say, okay, I can imagine that there is a unthinking substance existing outside of my mind. And he'll give the example of books in a locker or a table in a room. I'm looking for this example. But then he'll go on to say, yeah, but your little thought experiment is all occurring in your own mind. So you really didn't think of, so I'll just make one up here. Outside on the street, my car is parked there. Whether I'm observing it or not, it's out there. And it's not inconceivable that there's this unthinking substance, my car, existing outside of a mind. Berkeley will say, yeah, but wait a minute. You're thinking of that car in your mind right now. If you weren't thinking of it, you say it would still exist? How would you go about proving that? You wouldn't be able to prove it. All you've ever experienced are sense impressions and the way you organize them in your mind. So why do you assume there are these unthinking substances outside of your mind? You can't even form a conception of such a thing. And yet it's almost universally accepted that there are objects that exist outside of our mind. So he'll say, and this is where he brings in this important idea of the eternal mind of God. On the right-hand column of 74, so he numbers these paragraphs. Paragraph 6, some truths are so near and obvious to the mind that a man need only open his eyes to see them. Such I take this important one to be, to wit, that all the choir of heaven and furniture of the earth, in a word, all those bodies which compose the mighty frame of the world, have not any subsistence without a mind, that their being is to be perceived or known, that consequently so long as they are not actually perceived by me, or do not exist in my mind, or that of any other created spirit, they must either have no existence at all, or else subsist in the mind of some eternal spirit, it being perfectly unintelligible and involving all the absurdity of abstraction to attribute to any single part of them an existence independent of a spirit. So down a little lower at paragraph 8, but you say, though the ideas themselves do not exist without the mind, yet there may be things like them whereof they are copies or resemblances which things exist without the mind in an unthinking substance. I answer, an idea can be like nothing but an idea. A color or figure can be like nothing but another color or figure. If we look but never so little into our thoughts, we shall find it impossible for us to conceive a likeness, except only between our ideas. Again, I ask, whether these supposed originals or external things of which our ideas are the pictures or representations be themselves perceivable or not. If they are, then they are ideas, and we have gained our point. But if you say they are not perceivable, that is, I appeal to anyone, whether it be sense, to assert a color is like something which is invisible, hard or soft, like something which is intangible, and so of the rest. So, how could the idea of a color relate to something that has no visual characteristics? It doesn't make any sense, he's saying. So he'll go on to say, some there are who make a distinction betwixt primary and secondary qualities. By the former they mean extension, figure, motion, rest, solidity, or impenetrability in number. By the latter they denote all other sensible qualities as color, sounds, taste, and so forth. The ideas we have of these they acknowledge not to be the resemblances of anything existing without the mind or unperceived, that's the secondary qualities, but they will have our ideas of the primary qualities to be patterns or images of things which exist without the mind in an unthinking substance which they call matter. By matter, therefore, we are to understand an inert, senseless substance in which extension, figure, and motion do actually subsist, but it is evident from what we have already shown that extension, figure, and motion are only ideas existing in the mind, and that an idea can be like nothing but another idea, and that consequently neither they nor their archetypes can exist in an unperceiving substance. Hence, it is plain that the very notion of what is called matter or corporeal substance involves a contradiction in it. I'm going to skip over here to page 75. He brings up, it's just the right-hand column, same page. Here he brings up a point that John Locke brought up on page 69. So if you're comparing and contrasting these empiricists and, trying to decide who makes a better argument, well, it helps to point out the places where they actually refer to each other's work. So in paragraph 14, the right-hand column, thus, for instance, it is said that heat and cold are affections only of the mind, and not at all patterns of real beings existing in the corporeal substances which excite them, for that the same body which appears cold to one hand seems warm to another. That was John Locke's example on 69. He's proving that the secondary qualities don't exist in matter, they only exist in the mind, because you can have some water, and you can have one hand that's hot and one hand that's cold. Put one hand near a fire, put another hand out the window in the winter. Now put both hands alternately in that water. The warm hand's going to experience the water is cold. The cold hand's going to experience the water is warm, because the motion of the particles in your hand that are warm are more rapid, causing the sensation of heat. The motions of the atoms in your hand that are outside the window are slower, which creates less heat relative to the motion of the atoms in the water. If it's, the cold hand will feel it as warmer. So at any rate, that's how Locke is trying to describe everything. These secondary qualities are created by the motion of the primary qualities. Now Berkeley's saying, okay, now let's take that example. Now why may we not as well argue that figure and extension are not patterns or resemblances of qualities existing in matter, because to the same eye at different stations, or eyes of a different texture at the same station, they appear various and cannot therefore be the images of anything settled and determinate without the mind. So why a figure and extension, those are supposed to be primary qualities, but they appear different to different people, just like heat and cold, sour and sweet. And if the reason that you say the secondary qualities don't actually belong to the material objects, you prove that by showing how they can change from different subjective perspectives. Well, the primary qualities can also change depending on the changes of the perspective of that. So it's another reason Berkeley's saying you can't separate secondary and primary qualities. And then at the bottom of page 75, he says, in short, let anyone consider those arguments which are thought manifestly to prove that colors and tastes exist only in the mind, and he shall find that they may with equal force be brought to prove the same thing of extension, figure, and motion. Though it must be confessed, this method of arguing doth not so much prove that there is no extension or color in an outward object, as that we do not know by sense which is the true extension or color of the object. All right, so he gets into more details of his argument. Here's lower on page 76, the left-hand column. He brings up a point that Descartes brought up, that Locke was ridiculing to some degree, and that is that we have dreams. Why do you assume there must be some material object existing outside of the mind to cause our sensations of things like the secondary and primary qualities of matter? Why must they be caused by some outward object? Because we have dreams where we think we have ideas of objects when we know they're not they don't correlate to anything outside of our mind. So we see that it happens sometimes in dreams. It could happen all the time, that our experiences in the mind are just that, ideas in the mind. There's no need to bring in this parallel universe of material objects that nobody can perceive. So I'll just read a little bit here. But what reason can induce us to believe the existence of bodies without the mind from what we perceive? Since the very patrons of matter themselves do not pretend there is any necessary connection betwixt them and our ideas. How do inert material objects create ideas in the mind? That's the mind-body problem. He's saying, Berkeley is saying, that even the materialists say they don't know how that happens. So I say it is granted on all hands, and what happens in dreams, frenzies, and the like puts it beyond dispute, that it is possible we might be affected with all the ideas we have now, though no bodies existed without resembling them. Hence it is evident the supposition of external bodies is not necessary for the producing our ideas, since it is granted they are produced sometimes and might possibly be produced always in the same order we see them in at present without their concurrence. Okay, so I'm going to skip over to page 77, left-hand column, more than halfway down. He says, a little attention will discover to anyone the truth and evidence of what is here said, and make it unnecessary to insist on any other proofs against the existence of material substances. The ideas of sense are more strong, lively, and distinct than those of the imagination. So there's ideas of sense, and then there's ideas of the imagination. What we call material objects are ideas of sense, sense perceptions, and then our inner ideas that we can just imagine anything we want. So the ideas of sense are more strong, lively, and distinct than those of imagination. Page 77, paragraph 30. They have likewise a steadiness, order, and coherence, and are not excited at random, as those which are the effects of human wills, often are, but in a regular train or series, the admirable connection whereof sufficiently testifies the wisdom and benevolence of its author. So here's the mind of God. That's why the so-called material world is such an orderly thing. It seems to be this independent reality existing outside of the mind. In fact, it's just the ideas in God's mind. Now, the set rules or established methods wherein the mind we depend on excites in us the ideas of sense are called the laws of nature. And these we learn by experience, which teaches us that such and such ideas are attended with such and such other ideas in the ordinary course of things. This is his empiricism. How do you learn the laws of nature? Through sense impressions, through experience, through being alive and having sensory impressions. The big point he's making here is that these sense impressions are just that, ideas in the mind. They are not caused, and they do not represent objects that exist outside of the mind, or at least outside of a mind. If they exist outside of our mind, they continue to exist in God's universal mind. So I'll read this important point again. Now, the set rules or established methods wherein the mind we depend on excites in us the ideas of sense are called the laws of nature, and these we learn by experience, which teaches us that such and such ideas are attended with such and such other ideas in the ordinary course of things. This gives us a sort of foresight, which enables us to regulate our actions for the benefit of the life. Skipping down to paragraph 33, the ideas imprinted on the senses by the author of nature are called real things, and those excited in the imagination being less regular, vivid, and constant are more properly termed ideas or images of things which they copy and represent. But then our sensations, be they never so vivid and distinct, are nevertheless ideas. That is, they exist in the mind or are perceived by it as truly as the ideas of its own framing. The ideas of sense are allowed to have more reality in them, that is, to be more strong, orderly, and coherent than the creatures of the mind, but this is no argument that they exist without the mind. They are also less dependent on the spirit or thinking substance which perceives them, in that they are excited by the will of another and more powerful spirit. Yet still they are ideas, and certainly no idea, whether faint or strong, can exist otherwise than in a mind perceiving it. So there's Berkeley. He's an empiricist, but he believes in God. He's not a materialist. Usually you would think empiricists think, like John Locke, knowledge comes from perceiving unthinking matter. Berkeley, who became a bishop in the, I'm not even sure which denomination, but a bishop in a Christian religion said you can be an empiricist and still believe in God, and that this whole theory of matter doesn't make any sense. But there's one logical problem with Berkeley's philosophy, and that is, he says repeatedly that an idea can be like nothing but an idea. How could an unthinking substance create an idea in the mind? That only like things can interact with other things of the same nature. So this completely opposite nature of unthinking substance and the thinking substance of the mind, how would that work? Matter and ideas are totally different. However, he also says that minds and ideas are totally different. On page 74, on the left-hand column, paragraph 2, but besides all that endless variety of ideas or objects of knowledge, there is likewise something which knows or perceives them and exercises diverse operations, as willing, imagining, remembering about them. This perceiving act of being is what I call mind, spirit, soul, or myself, by which words I do not denote any one of my ideas, but a thing entirely distinct from them, wherein they exist, or, which is the same thing, whereby they are perceived, for the existence of an idea consists in being perceived. Entirely distinct. The mind is entirely distinct from the ideas it perceives. But if an idea can be like nothing but another idea, and there can be no contact between an idea and the mind and some unthinking substance, similarly, how can there be contact between a mind, which is entirely distinct from ideas, and the ideas that it has? How do the ideas get contained in a mind? Is there some boundary made of ideas to block the ideas from exiting the mind? So that's a problem that he would have to address to make his philosophy more comprehensive. But at any rate, at this point, we're moving on to David Hume, who agrees with Berkeley that the secondary and primary qualities are all ideas in the mind. Sense perceptions is what they are. He agrees that you can't prove that these sense perceptions in your mind are caused by objects outside of your mind. But he doesn't say, therefore, we must assume that these so-called material objects are the ideas in God's mind. There's no evidence for that. There's no empirical evidence for that. And in a later reading, he'll go on to say there's no empirical evidence for the existence of a self. If you want to get down to business, an enduring self that stays the same from moment to moment. All we have is a constant volley of sense impressions and memories. They come and they go. There's no endurance to them. It's this fleeting barrage of discrete, unconnected sense perceptions and our ideas about them. That's what you might call a self. Very similar to the Buddhist philosophy, and we'll get into that later in the book. But here, in this study of knowledge, epistemology, what can I know? What David Hume wants to do, and he doesn't differ from Locke and Berkeley on this. So Locke and Berkeley both say you can only learn the laws of nature through sense perceptions. Now, Locke and Berkeley both believe in a mind, we are a mind, and there's a God. But they don't think that we're born with ideas imprinted on our soul, other than perhaps the idea of God, which Locke mentions twice, and I've talked about that. But all of our knowledge of the universe comes from experiencing it through our sense perceptions. And that knowledge isn't derived from some kind of programmed, certain absolute knowledge imprinted on the soul. We learn it through experience. The rationalists say that our souls are imprinted with certain forms of knowledge and reason can discover them. And they're absolutely true everywhere in the universe. And so Locke is saying, well, at any rate, we can have knowledge that's good enough to help preserve ourselves on this planet. Maybe Descartes' right, and we live in a dream, but does that really change anything on how we go about, I doubt that's the fact. Maybe you can't prove it, but, put your hand in the furnace and you'll wake up from your dream soon enough. Maybe we can't have absolute certain universal knowledge from deductive reasoning based on these premises of the a priori knowledge imprinted on our souls, like the rationalists say, but we can have pretty certain knowledge based on sense experiences, seeing how things have happened in the past, and assuming that these same patterns will repeat in the future. It might not be this guaranteed, certain knowledge that the rationalists say we should strive for, but it serves our purposes well enough, and it helps us survive and be happy. That is what Locke says, and that is also what Berkeley says. I'm going to just try to get this page number here. If you on page 70 and 71, that's where Locke talks about, our senses. They might not give us absolute certain knowledge, but they serve us well enough. Page 70 and 71, you can find that. Berkeley says basically the same thing on page 77. This knowledge gives us a sort of foresight, which enables us to regulate our actions for the benefit of life. It helps us deal with pleasure and pain. Okay, so Hume is going to, it's not that he differs radically about his belief that knowledge comes from empirical observations, but what he focuses on is that we can't be absolutely certain about this knowledge, because it's just based on observing things as they've occurred in the past. And there's no reason to assume that the future must always necessarily resemble the past. Events have occurred in a certain sequence in the past. Putting hands in fires causes pain. You can guide your life on that assumption that the future will follow the past. You have to. And he's not disputing that. But he's saying, as a philosopher, I'm just trying to discover what are the limits of certain absolute knowledge. Can we have it? And Hume's a skeptic. He doesn't think we can. He thinks that the limits of the human mind prevent us from gaining absolute certain knowledge about the real world of matters of fact, is what he calls it. We can have absolute certain knowledge of the relations of ideas in our own minds, such as in the world of mathematics, but he's saying that's only because we invented that world. It's a closed system that doesn't necessarily apply to the outer world. We can be certain about the relationships between our own fictions. We make up the rules, and then we make those rules apply in our mental games, but that doesn't help us learn about the real world of sense impressions and how they behave. And so again, like Berkeley, he doesn't necessarily believe there's material objects existing outside of the mind correlating to these sense impressions. He's skeptical. He doesn't know what causes us to have these sense impressions because, as he'll go on to show, he doesn't believe in causality itself. That this event causes that event, he's saying, is just a customary habit of the mind that we introduce after perceiving things happening in an orderly fashion in the past. All right, so that's the main point. I'll read a few excerpts and then we'll just call it a day. All right, so David Hume, page 78. This is an inquiry concerning human understanding. You know what I'm going to do is actually skip over to page 79. On the right-hand column near the bottom, all the objects of human reason or inquiry may naturally be divided into two kinds, to wit, relations of ideas and matters of fact. Of the first kind are the sciences of geometry, algebra, and arithmetic, and in short, every affirmation which is either intuitively or demonstratively certain. Then he talks about the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared in a right-angled triangle. The hypotenuse squared is equal to the square of each of the sides added together. And he says that's a proposition that expresses a relation between these figures, that 3 times 5 is equal to the half of 30. All right, 3 times 5 is 15, which is half of 30, expresses a relation between these numbers. Propositions of this kind are discoverable by the mere operation of thought without dependence on what is anywhere existent in the universe. So these are just ideas in the mind. There doesn't have to be a circle anywhere in the universe for you to know the mathematical laws of the circle. Doesn't that therefore give us absolute knowledge of the universe? He's saying no, because they don't necessarily apply, these relations of ideas. They don't necessarily apply to sense impressions, which he calls matters of fact. Continuing on 80, matters of fact, which are the second objects of human reason, are not ascertained in the same manner. Then he'll go on to say the contrary of every matter of fact is still possible because it can never imply a contradiction and is conceived by the mind with the same facility and distinctness as if ever so conformable to reality. You cannot conceive of a relation of ideas, which is deductive reasoning, which we talked about earlier in the class, being other than it is. So once you know that 2 plus 2 is 4, the laws of mathematics will not allow you to imagine 2 plus 2 equals 5. He is saying you can pretend that you can imagine it, but really it would be impossible because these concepts don't work. That's the way relations of ideas work. They follow in a definite order, and it can only be in one way, and you can have certain knowledge that it's going to end up in a certain way. But matters of fact, which are the second objects of human reason, are not ascertained in the same manner. The contrary of every matter of fact is still possible. The sun will not rise tomorrow, he said. You can imagine that. That's a matter of fact. What do you perceive? A sunrise. Can you perceive it not rising tomorrow? Yes, I can. Can you perceive 2 plus 2 equals 5? No, I can't. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a relation of ideas. You cannot conceive it being other than it is. You can have absolute knowledge of it, but it doesn't give you any certain knowledge of the outer world. Matters of fact, the so-called outer world, or at any rate the world of sense perceptions, you can imagine it being other than it is, and so you can't have certain knowledge of it. His point here is that matters of fact you can only gain knowledge of through observing things, and that only gives you probable knowledge of how things probably will work in the future. You cannot gain absolute knowledge of the so-called material world, which creates sense impressions in your mind. Certain knowledge of how that world works is not possible for human beings, he says. That's his skepticism. He says, maybe it is, but I, at any rate, can't figure out how that would be possible. And he breaks it down to the point of causality. So I'm trying to, I'm just looking at the time here and realizing we're closing in on an hour. The idea of cause and effect. So let me just skip over to page 82, left-hand column. This is near the bottom here, the second half of the left-hand column. What is the nature of all our reasonings concerning matter of fact? The proper answer seems to be that they are founded on the relation of cause and effect. When again it is asked, what is the foundation of all our reasonings and conclusions concerning that relation? It may be replied in one word, experience. But if we still carry on our sifting humor and ask, what is the foundation of all conclusions from experience? Then he'll say, on the right-hand column, I'm going to skip a little bit, I shall content myself in this section with an easy task and shall pretend only to give a negative answer to the question here proposed. So the question is, what is the foundation of all conclusions from experience? He's looking for a certain absolute trustworthy first principle upon which he can ground certain knowledge of the universe. We saw René Descartes says, the one thing I can't doubt is my own doubting, my own thinking. And if I think, I must exist. Even if I doubt everything else, I can't doubt the fact that I'm doubting. To doubt something, I must be a thinking being. So I think, therefore I am. Is there some trustworthy foundational first principle for David Hume? He says, I shall content myself in this section with an easy task, and he'll only give a negative answer to the question here proposed. I say then that even after we have experience of the operations of cause and effect, our conclusions from the experience are not founded on reasoning or any process of the understanding. So what he seems to be doing here is saying that knowledge of cause and effect, which governs what we call the material world, we don't have reasons to be certain, to have certain knowledge of that. Deductive reasoning, he's saying. Deductive reasoning, you start with a general principle, and then you break it down to more particular examples. So every, I'm just trying to think of a general principle. What was that we used before for Socrates that Aristotle used? all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, or Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. If the premise is true in a deductive argument, then and every link in the argument relates to that premise correctly, then you can be sure the conclusion is true. If all men are mortal, and if Socrates is a man, then it's necessarily true that Socrates is also mortal. That's deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is going from many particular examples to some general conclusion. Many times in the past, I've put my hand near fire or things that are hot, and it hurts. So I'm going to make this theory that fire causes pain in flesh when it gets too close. But you can't be absolutely certain of that, because all you're doing is saying, well, I've seen this event in the past repeatedly, and I assume that it'll probably occur in the future. But you can't be absolutely certain. There's no reason to be absolutely certain that the future must necessarily resemble the past. That is the point that Hume hammers home again and again. This idea of cause and effect is something that the human inserts into this chain of events. Event A happens, then event B. Event A is finger goes near flame. Event B is pain is felt in brain of person with finger. Flame causes the pain. That's natural to think that, says Hume, but you can't prove it. There is no, what is this cause? What does it look like, smell like, taste like? I don't see it. I see event A, I see event B. I don't see any connecting principle. The mind is inserting that causal principle and assumes, therefore, that it's discovered some universal truth. But all it's really doing is inferring how the future will probably appear based on the past. And that does not give you absolute certain knowledge. It gives you very helpful knowledge, but it isn't absolute certain knowledge. So on the right-hand column of page 84, he says, custom, then, is the great guide of human life. It is that principle alone which renders our experience useful to us and makes us expect for the future a similar train of events with those which have appeared in the past. Without the influence of custom, we should be entirely ignorant of every matter of fact beyond what is immediately present to the memory and senses. We should never know how to adjust means to ends or to employ our natural powers in the production of any effect. There would be an end at once of all action as well as the chief part of speculation. All right, so we've gone over the British empiricists, John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume. I think I've given you enough material to answer these exam questions, which I'll just read once again. Part A, question 2. What are the similarities and differences between the empiricist views of knowledge put forth by Locke, Berkeley, and Hume? Which position is better argued? Why? And explain. So the main thing here is you've got to mention all three of these. What are the similarities and differences? And which position is better argued? It's kind of a subjective opinion, but generally you would think the guys who come later are better argued because they're taking into account what the guys who came before them already brought up. But the main point is, prove to me you read the material by bringing in pertinent quotes from the book. All right, so that is the question for part A. For part B, what is empiricism? What is rationalism? What is idealism? What is skepticism? Explain Locke's tabula rasa idea. Explain Leibniz's criticisms of Locke, which we did in the previous video, and explain Berkeley's argument against matter. So we went over all those questions, and in the next video we will be going over Immanuel Kant.